Hello everyone, it's Astrobear here, and today I want to share with you some insights I've picked up from speaking with A&R professionals, label managers, and others in the music industry. And while I'm still relatively new to the scene, my journey has been very humbling and I've learned a lot of lessons already, especially from some conversations with industry figures such as the Mousetrap A&R team and Graham Sahara. And Graham is actually a seasoned label manager with a wealth of knowledge on everything labels are looking for because he's the person signing people to labels. And I had the opportunity to meet him recently at a music making retreat called Mixmasters, which is part of why I'm making this video. So basically, I had the afternoon with some other people at the retreat to show our tracks to Graham and get his advice on, what we needed to do to polish our songs off and get them ready to release on a label. And I did remember to record that session, so I'll show footage from that session with Graham at the end of the video, and definitely stay tuned because he's the real expert. But that session was a little more specific to my music and a specific sound I'm working towards. So before I dive into that, let's first go through my top 10 general tips for anyone who's trying to pitch their first release to a label. Let's go. Tip number 1. Your track needs a main idea. It doesn't need 1,000 different little ideas. It needs one main idea that's impressionable. And it sounds kind of obvious, right? Like, of course my track needs a main idea. You don't need me to be telling you that. But at the same time, I see producers of all different levels missing this first most important checkbox. And I think there's different reasons it's affecting the different levels of producers. So I want to dive into that a little bit more. So first off, what I mean by a main idea is like the part of the track you're going to be remembering a week later. Like it's like identity. And you don't need to be writing pop music. Like this doesn't need to be some hook that's you literally can't get out of your head because it's so catchy, it's almost annoying. But it needs to have some personality, right? Like we're not, we need the listeners to have something they want to return to, something they remember about it. And that's what I mean by a main idea. And I don't think that this takes like a lot of years practice to do. I think anyone that's inspired to make music and goes and puts, pen to paper and goes out and do it, I think the ideas are there. I think that's what's inspiring them to make music is they have their ideas. I think the problem with beginners is that they have too many ideas and they try and cram them all into one track. And it's like the main idea is drowning in all these ideas and, it dies. And when the main idea dies, your track's back to having no personality. And it's like a metaphor, but I see it happen all the time. And I think it's kind of an arrangement issue. I'll talk more about arrangement tips for sending to labels. But yeah, basically like beginners, they have this main idea and obviously they need the track to stretch out to a longer length of time. They need to keep interest. And then they don't know all the arrangement tricks or, they don't have the chops there yet. And so they just keep adding ideas. Like they think that's arrangement. It's like, oh, if I want to build interest in this track, I need to keep adding more and more things. And then the track, like I said, it just gets drowned. So that's my first tip is like find a main idea that you like. That's really, the best idea in your track. And then learn arrangement and learn how to stretch the idea out into a final track. And that's what you want to send to labels. All right. Tip number 2 is to have a swift arrangement. And what I mean by that is that main idea that we just talked about, you want to get to that as quick as you can in the song. And this advice, I think it came from Mousetrap while I was working on So Says the Sea with them. And basically the original version of the song that I sent to them had a long 2, maybe 3-minute intro. And they came back to me and said, listen, John, we like the song. The 2-3-minute intro, I kind of get what you were going for, but we just know it's not going to work. And it's because Mousetrap knows their listeners. They know how they're thinking, and they knew that the listeners were not going to give the same attention span to me, like a new artist on the label who's pretty much unknown. They weren't going to give me the same attention span as they were going to give Deadmau5. That's just the truth. And it's not about what makes the best music. Like I love long 2-3-minute intros. Those are some of my favorite Deadmau5 tracks with the really long, beautiful intros. It's what makes the payoff so good, right? But just the truth of the matter is they knew that the new artists weren't going to give me that same time of day. So I needed to get to the idea quicker. It was good advice. Like I get it. And I think that I probably was able to retain a lot more listeners by following that advice. Tip number 3 is to have an exciting arrangement. And this is another piece of advice I got from the Mousetrap A&R team. And once again, they were explaining how listeners on their label have a pretty short attention span when it comes to a new artist that they're not familiar with yet. And so if the song ever gets repetitive or boring, they're just going to skip to the next song and never really return to it or engage with it. So what you need to be doing is adding these subtle changes throughout the song that still carry the main idea of the song, but add these exciting variations to it that keep the listener on their toes and engaged with the music. And then they'll want to like return to it, and it's good for the label, it's good for you. So the key here is that the changes need to be subtle. It's very easy to accidentally do a very abrupt change and just completely change the direction of the song with these arrangement changes. And then you're sort of like killing the vibe of the song. You're losing the identity of the track. So you need to be making sure that these changes are not too chaotic or confusing. Tip number 4 is to make sure your mixdown fits the label sound. So it's just the truth of the matter that you do need to get your mixing engineer chops up to a certain level where your mixes can blend seamlessly into the label's catalog. When I was talking with Graham about this, as he put it, you should be able to do a DJ set with the label's entire catalog, throw your song into the middle of it, and not notice anything kind of funky or weird about your song blending into the other songs from the label. If you can pull that off, you're probably ready to send your song off to the label. But if you're struggling with it, maybe some advice would be to start mixing with reference tracks. As you're balancing your kicks and your snares and your synths and so on, A/B test with tracks from that label and kind of try and match the way they balance sounds. But honestly, it's going to take some time. You can't just learn all of mixing in a short amount of time or train your ear. You need a lot of practice with this. But when you learn all the tools, you start developing your ear, you can get there. I'm sure of it. So just keep going if you're still struggling. Number 5 is to give it time. And this is some advice from Graham, which he highlighted and underlined several times. So he must see issues with this a lot. And it's when producers kind of just send the track right from the studio. They just finished a kind of initial draft of a mix. It sounded really good in their ears. They were vibing with it. And it's great to be like excited, but sometimes your ears have kind of adjusted to the song, and you're sort of not hearing a unbiased perspective, and your mixdown really isn't there. You're sort of missing that tip 4 just because you haven't given it the time to let your ears refresh. So even though you're really excited about it, you just finished this mix down, give it some time, maybe even up to like a week or 2 for your ears to adjust. You sort of forget everything. And then on your next listen through, you'll have a less biased perspective. You can notice where things are poking out that they shouldn't be. Go and fix those issues, and then you're ready to send it off to the label manager. All right, tip number 6 is to know your label. This is very common advice. It's probably the first thing a label professional will tell you when you're asking them for advice, and it's because labels are usually curating very specific sounds these days. Depends on the label. Sometimes the label is curating more weird, varied directions, and the weirdness is almost the common thread between the tracks. But more often than not, the label is going to be curating a very specific sound. They find their role in the industry is to be kind of parsing through all the music and finding the stuff that fits this very specific style, so they can provide that to listeners that really like that style, or DJs that are looking for like a very specific style to, make a consistent DJ mix and so on. So yeah, do your research on the label, find out what they've been putting out, especially recently, labels styles change all the time. So you got to make sure you're not putting out what they did 8 years ago. Find out what they're trying to sign now, find where your track would fit, and make sure you're giving the label something that they can actually work with. Tip number 7, strategize your release journey. You probably have some dream label with your favorite artists and you'd really like to release with them. But oftentimes those bigger labels are looking for semi-established artists, and it's just like in any career where there's that entry-level job that requires experience. And it's like, well, how am I going to get experience if I can't get the entry-level job? A chicken and the egg problem. It's frustrating, but maybe some advice is to aim for smaller labels first. Or some other good advice I heard is look at artists on your dream label and try to see what was their journey to get there. Did they release on smaller labels first? Maybe you can try and copycat their release journey, or at least take some inspiration by targeting similar sized labels at first and kind of climbing up a ladder to get to that dream label. It's not a rule or anything. You can go ahead and send your tracks to the big label right off the bat. But I know how frustrating it is to not hear back from labels. So just some advice, maybe start out smaller and climb up to the big labels. Tip number 7 is to be consistent. So as you're gaining listeners, as you're gaining followers, you want to be able to meet their expectations so they stay with you for your journey, right? This isn't advice I necessarily do very well. So it's kind of a case of do as I say, not as I do. But industry experts have told me this is important. So it's probably worth talking about. And I've heard it's important to be consistent in your release schedule. You should be releasing several times a year, just so your fans know when they can expect to hear something new from you and you stay relevant in their memory and in their algorithm or whatever. You also want to be consistent in your sound. Or maybe it's a good idea to be consistent in your sound. It's definitely something I don't do. I release in all sorts of genres, but I've heard it's better if you can stick to one sound, just so your listeners know what to expect. If you're trying to play live, booking agents, if you're releasing all sorts of genres, they might not know exactly what you're going to play. Whereas if you have a consistent sound, it makes it a little easier on them. All this said, my favorite band, can I point that way? Yeah. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, they make metal music, jazz music, electronic music all over the map, and they kind of are consistently inconsistent, and that's why I think people love them. So maybe there's hope for people like me, maybe like you, that like so many different things they can't stick to one sound. I don't know. Hopefully there's hope for people like us, right? Tip number 9, effective communication. This is when you're ready to send that email to your dream label. You've checked all the other boxes on the list. Your music's ready, and now you just need to send a nice professional email so that they'll actually listen to your music. So make sure you first introduce yourself. When I was talking to Graham about this, he said he couldn't believe how many people just send him a link with no text. And it's just kind of off-putting for professionals, right? So just briefly introduce yourself. Also, you don't want to send a wall of text. Keep it concise. Don't give them a life history, and maybe try and explain why this track belongs in their label in a couple 3-4 bullet points. Maybe explain you've mixed it in with their other tracks and it fits in. Give examples of those tracks that you think fit. Show them that you've done your research. If you've played this out live, if you're a DJ, maybe explain that you've shown that this works on the dance floor. If you have footage from that can be something you include in the email. Actually, that's compelling. And then the SoundCloud link. I think that's the state of the industry, is sending private SoundCloud links. Make sure it's private. Make sure it's a shareable link that they can open up. And yeah, just I've heard it's best to send 2 to 4 tracks at once so they kind of have an idea of your sound. Maybe they just want to select one as a single, but it's a good idea to give them options and also kind of show them what's your kind of range. Maybe prove to them you can be consistent. Last tip. Find your balance between being the producer and the artist. Straddle that line between producing a track that fits into the label's existing sound while still being an artist that can offer a fresh sound that excites the label manager and really makes them want to sign you. If you think about it, this is especially important for newer artists because the label manager is looking for a consistent sound. I already highlighted that in tip number 6, right? But even though they're looking for a consistent sound, they already have an existing catalog of artists that can make that sound, right? So if you're a new artist, how are you going to stand out? Well, that's where your artistic vision can really kick in. And I'm not going to lie, this is going to be a hard task. Any of my tips that involve kind of balancing somewhat competing objectives are always going to be the more difficult ones. How are you going to fit in with the label while also standing out? Well, it takes a lot of practice, but it's worth it, I promise. And when I went on this recent music retreat where I was able to meet with Graham Sahara, the label manager I keep talking about, I came in with this retreat with the intention of kind of giving more importance to my artistic vision. So I came in with some of my weirdest ideas. And for the beginning of the retreat, I was working with some great music coaches, including Martin Stimming, Robert Babich, Jay Lumen, and Funk Devoid, to try and help me fine-tune this new style into a sound that can maybe work with a wider audience or maybe fit in with a label. And honestly, the response that I've gotten from this track that I've shown it to has been definitely the strongest I've ever had. Definitely stronger than any tracks where I'm just always laser focused on fitting into a label sound. So now I can share the footage of Graham Sahara, the label manager, reacting to the track and giving me the advice on what I need to do to take this new style into something that's ready to release on the label. So let's roll that footage.
Let's go.
Moto bass.
Ah, cause that's fucking dope, man. That sounds really fucking cool, man. That does not sound normal.
What records?
No, it's just that's a vibe. Like it sounds different to everything else. That stands out on its own. There's a little bit where it got a little bit noisy in the middle of it. I'm thinking, all right, fair enough. If you had a really indie vocalist on that, there's one of these guys, 40 Thieves. They did some tracks. That sort of there's a certain sound, a vocalist over the top of that with the guitar you've got is so cool. That would be a really badass fucking track. It stands out big time. It's a groove, man. It's a serious groove. It stands out so differently to everything else. I really, really like that. I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, it just needs that. If you've got a certain particular vocal on it that just flows with it, that would be a serious tune. Yeah, that's a vibe, man. That's a really, like I say, it really stands out straight away. I'm like, where is that guitar come from? Because it stands out so differently, which is such an important thing. because otherwise it's like, oh right, it's another Afterlife track, it's another techno track. It's just like there ain't no other track sounding like that. You know, maybe you could get another vocalist on, but that stands right out. It's right.
So yeah, Graham's reaction to the track I made at the retreat was mostly positive, which was really encouraging, especially since I went on the retreat with the intention of coming with like my weirdest ideas and seeing if I could get anything to stick. I didn't expect that like my weirdest ideas to have such a better reaction than my usual like more formulaic ideas. And so it just goes to show like taking artistic risks can definitely pay off. And I think Graham is definitely right of his criticisms. Like this track is still like missing something, maybe some indie male vocals, like he mentioned is right. My last kind of hidden piece of advice is if a label exec does give you some tips or like asks for some changes in your song, it's probably a good idea to seriously consider that and make those changes. In fact, Graham has mentioned, and I've also experienced this at Mousetrap, they'll ask for some specific change and you make it, and then they can sign the track and you're golden. So definitely take what they say seriously. Most of them are former producers and DJs, if not current producers and DJs. So label execs definitely know what they're talking about and take their advice seriously. And speaking of that, like Graham said, I need some indie male vocals. So if any of you guys have a good indie male vocalist, or if you are an indie male vocalist, hit me up. Maybe we can work together and get that track signed. That's all I've got for today. I hope you learned something useful. Like I said, I'm still learning, so I'm not necessarily an expert of all of this stuff, but I think I've already learned some tips that maybe can help some of you looking for your first release. And as I've said before, if you're inspired to make music, I really think you can do it. Just put in the time and effort to get your main ideas polished. And best of luck on your journey.